Thanks, Hoyin, for the kind words. Well, yeah, so the title of the lecture today is Voisin, to make for series of repetition. And I think maybe it's as well a little bit, the subtitle is as well probably like and beyond, because we were going to show as well a little bit of our own work, which is kind of maybe like a response as well to both of these, both of them, like Voisin and my phone. So Jason and myself, we're teaching architecture at the University of Hong Kong, and we're doing as well currently like a research project which looks at housing estates in Hong Kong. And so we hope to kind of, can you see that?
Maybe could we dim the lights a little bit?
Better. Well, that's all. So we hope to kind of like eventually put the findings into a book in the coming years. So basically the book is about housing. Housing in Hong Kong is quite special, and it's one of the most fundamental issues, I would say, in Hong Kong. So housing started kind of in Hong Kong, I guess, like that was really becoming an issue was with a major fire on the 25th of December 1953, where a major fire destroyed it like a settlement called HKICON, which was a squatter village basically. And after that fire, 53,000 people were basically homeless. So that put kind of the government into pressure to kind of think about like a solution. And so looking at the housing sector in Hong Kong, so you have the public sector. This is kind of a timeline. You can't see much, I guess. Too bad. Anyway, on the top is the public sector, and on the bottom is the private sector. And so since that fire in 1950s, there has been a lot of kind of different developments in terms of typology in Hong Kong. But it started probably all with kind of the Penang shop house. The Chinese typical shop house, which is kind of like, if you look at Hong Kong in general, especially like on the island, like all the plot sizes are kind of still somehow a reminiscence of these Chinese shop houses. So this was the kind of first estate. This was basically built after that fire, the HKICON estate, and to house like these 53,000 people. And I actually don't have the number now. How many of these they're called kind of H block typologies, yeah, which were basically, if you look at this on the outer rim, that's basically like a semi-public access corridor, and so the housing was inside. So it was actually very interesting typology in terms of neighborhood generation. But like Hong Kong has as well many different models of housing, or had different models. I mean, if you look at Kowloon City, which contained about 33,000 residents on a 2.6 hectare kind of piece of land, and was kind of existed from the 1950s to the 1990s. Was demolished, I think, 1990, late 90s, I think.
94.
Huh?
I think 94.
94, yeah. So the Kowloon City was kind of like the densest place basically in terms of inhabitants on Earth until it was demolished. This is kind of again like this H block, which was basically one of these typologies developed in the 1950s. We have other typologies in Hong Kong. We have the pencil tower, which is basically on the smallest piece of land, how to build like a question of how to build a high-rise on the smallest piece of land, and usually only contains one flat per level. And so we have like as well the chunking mansion, which is kind of in today's world, I guess like one of the most densest building in Hong Kong, where it's estimated that there are 4,000 people living in the mansion. And it's kind of like one of the first blocks which kind of used as well a so-called podium with a tower on top, which was built in the 1960s first. Here you can see just like an interior diagram of that, and the red represents different kind of clusters of program. Though it's kind of like a residential building, it's actually extremely rich in terms of different programs. There are hostels, hotels, restaurants, even factories, lots of shops. So it's a very, very rich programmatic mix in that building. So you have as well, on the other hand, informal settlements in Hong Kong, which are kind of rooftop settlements. As well, another very interesting typology in Hong Kong. And we have as well the so-called, and this is May 4, the so-called private housing estates. Yeah? And May 4 was the first one to be developed in Hong Kong in 1965. It was built from 1965 until 1978 in 8 phases, and it contains 99 towers, which they look identical, they're not identical, but they look identical, and it accommodates around 70,000 to 80,000 people. And I guess I'm giving it over to Jason now.
Yeah.
Correct?
Well, I think we became very interested in looking at private housing estates, number one, because of their size and scale, the number of people living in them. Number two, because a lot of research had already been done or has been done about the variety of Hong Kong's public housing typologies, which have changed over the years and developed into different forms and different shapes. But we were having trouble finding a lot of information about the kind of private side, which it tends to be more developer-driven. It tends to be developers working in conjunction with government. And they tend to follow, because they're profit-driven enterprises, they tend to follow and exploit the building codes to great effect. And by looking at these buildings, you almost can graphically see the way the building code in Hong Kong works. So Christian and I are architects. We don't claim to be architectural historians so much. So we're approaching the research work really as architects and as designers. So forgive us, I don't know how many architectural historians are sitting in the audience today, but we're approaching it as designers and using the private estate research really as a platform to rethink housing in Hong Kong, to use as a basis for our own design work. And of course, thanks to the consulate and to Hoyin for asking us to kind of present this work today. And of course, these large private housing estates in Hong Kong have a relationship to the work that Le Corbusier was doing in the early part of the 20th century on some of his more purist and abstract urban plans and forms. So the plan Voisin was kind of one of those three. Again, I don't know how many architects are in the audience today, but Charles-Edouard Jeanneret, better known to everyone, or at least architects, as Le Corbusier, was born in 1887 and died in 1965, actually the same year that the Mai Fu development was started, coincidentally. Was an architect, designer, urbanist, and a prolific writer. So in addition to all of his works and drawings, he actually wrote a lot about them as well. He was originally born in Switzerland, but then became a French citizen in 1930. We're not sure which way he would have rooted last night in the France versus Switzerland match in the World Cup. So congratulations to all the French in the audience. This is one of his first books published towards an architecture, or towards a new architecture, as it was kind of slightly mistranslated, which started to set up in the era after the First World War a set of beliefs that Le Corbusier promoted to Europe and to the world about the qualities of architecture that he thought were important in a modern age, in an age of the steamship and the train and the automobile. Modern technology and the Industrial Revolution was changing the way and the speed at which we lived, but of course he argued that architecture needed to catch up with that. So many of the urban plans, and which were laid out in this later book, Urbanism, or as it's kind of mistranslated or retranslated into English, The City of Tomorrow, and its planning from 1925 outlined not only his kind of beliefs in architecture, but then how those pieces of architecture and buildings would aggregate into cities, and then kind of laying out the foundations of what he thought was important in the 20th century about living. This began in 1920, 1923 with an idea for a city of towers. These kind of large 600-foot towers which were kind of spaced at actually quite a distance from each other, which would house offices and civic functions, which would be bathed in light, which would be clad in glass, were kind of a vision for him of the future and how the city might start to respond to things like the automobile. What we'll look at today or probably there were three plans that Le Corbusier spent most of that time working on. One was in 1922, a contemporary city for 3 million inhabitants, a project never realized and abstract in many senses in that it didn't have a site. It had an idea for kind of a center which had commercial cores and towers surrounded by residential areas, parks to one side, sports fields, an industrial area, and then garden cities. And then he wrote about this again extensively in his book, Urbanism, and then translated those ideas for another exhibition a few years later in Paris, which was sponsored by the Voisin automobile and airline company, or airplane company. So even the idea for an architect to go out and approach an automobile manufacturer to get sponsorship for this plan was very interesting in that he realized the role of the automobile in the city and wanted to kind of plan for that. So Plan Voisin took many of the ideas about housing and organization, linear organization around superhighways, and started to kind of lay them out within the core of Paris, within the Marais section, the sort of business center of Paris at the time. It was a radical idea to insert this super rational plan into the medieval core of Paris, and met in many ways with a lot of contempt and controversy after that exhibition. Later on, there was the Ville Radieuse, or the Radiant City, which also took forward many of these ideas, but changed housing a little bit. Again, these kind of main ideas of the importance of space and having enough space to kind of live and breathe, the rationale for a city that should move fast, right? For Le Corbusier, speed meant success in urban planning. The idea of health, of sunshine, of kind of fresh air for the city to move out of the kind of congested slums of places like Paris at the time and try to open up the urban environment for health, efficiency, and then mass production in reaction to the Industrial Revolution and all of the industry that was happening around world capitals like Paris at the time. Le Corbusier was influenced by people like Henry Ford and Taylor, who was one of the first efficiency engineers at the time, looking at manufacturing. This is a quote from Towards a New Architecture in 1924 by Le Corbusier, that we must create a mass production state of mind, a state of mind for building mass production housing, a state of mind for living in mass production housing, and a state of mind for conceiving mass production housing. That really, in this new society and era, we need to kind of reframe and rethink the way that our architecture works and our cities work. Again, this kind of reference to the plan and the kind of rationalism of the plan based on standardization and industrialization. So this is a view of his model for the Ville Contemporaire, the contemporary city for 3 million inhabitants, again with this kind of high-rise civic office core of these large, evenly spaced out towers. At the heart of the scheme was actually a train station and transportation hub that would link automobiles to trains to actually his idea for even having planes come and land in the middle of these towers. Surrounding that kind of business core was actually a set of low-rise housing blocks. And this is probably one of the, if the titles of this book were mistranslated in a sense, there was also a mistranslation in the idea of a tower or a city of towers that in his schemes was always meant to house businesses, offices, hotels, and civic functions. And when these plans were translated into other cities or appropriated by cities like New York and Hong Kong, the idea for a city of towers became one about housing rather than business. So actually in these plans, he had a series of relatively low-rise, six double-level plans that were for the housing in the periphery of the city. Again, he presented a lot of his drawings were about kind of putting the viewer in the position of trees and patios, kind of looking off into towers in the distance, or as the driver of an automobile in the lower image. Right, again, a kind of combination of the diagonal streets of Paris at the time and a very rational, evenly spaced, gridded city. Within the housing, very much like Hong Kong, as we'll present later, there is an idea about gardens and greenery and sports and leisure facilities just outside your doorstep to promote, again, a kind of healthy life that was created through a very efficient and rational sense of planning. One of his sketches of this idea of kind of towers in the park. More about the kind of setback housing that you wouldn't be living next to the street, but your apartment might be distanced from the street again and surrounded by greenery. And then again, when this kind of contemporary city is put into the heart of Paris, based around, this is one of the Voisin automobiles from the 1920s, the sponsor of the exhibition, you could see even in his representation of the plan, this huge distinction between his plan on the left, these evenly spaced towers straddling a superhighway, and then in his view, the sort of backwardness and congestion of the medieval street plan of Paris, which many of us today regard as one of the most kind of beautiful, livable cities. In Le Corbusier's frame of mind at the time, it was not livable at all. It was kind of hellish and horrific. So this was an idea to kind of clear everything out, to raise the city, to clear the city, and then to rebuild something from anew with a totally different scale, a totally different rhythm of life. One that he hoped would actually create, to go from an 8-hour working day down to a 4-hour working day, because we could all be so much more productive with our time that we wouldn't have to work as much. And again, one of the most kind of famous images, this one from the Plan Voisin of Le Corbusier's hand kind of floating above the city as if it's the sort of hand of the creator who was promoting this new vision of urbanism for Paris and the world. Now, of course, this is a still from Jacques Tati's 1967 film Playtime, which starts to critique in a kind of humorous way the ideas again of mass production and repetition and modern life in the sort of global world of the international style of architecture. So if you watch Playtime, there are these kind of different actors kind of struggling to find their way around Paris, which again has kind of been built as a modern kind of generic city. So these were critiques a little bit later, of course, in the 1960s, but critiques to what Corbusier had set up as a type of modernism. So now I think we'll, after that kind of very brief introduction of those ideas from the 1920s, I'll give the floor back to Christian, who will talk a little bit more about our research, what we're starting to draw and what we're starting to think about in the comparison between maybe those three projects, urban scale projects, and then the number of estates that we're looking at.
Yeah, so as said earlier, we are interested in a very specific urban form, which is called the private housing estate. Yeah? And as said earlier, like the Mai Fo Sun Chun is one of them and was the first one of them. Yeah? I'm going to go back to this timeline, which is not necessarily, well, let's zoom in a bit. It starts 1960s, and so on the top is basically the public sector, and on the bottom is the private sector. And when we started this research, Jason and myself, we looked at public housing, and public housing is quite diverse, and there has been a lot of development actually in terms of typologies. It's very difficult to see. I mean, you start with kind of an L-shaped typology, and that's a double square typology. Very difficult in terms of the plan. Anyway, so we discovered like that there was very little information about the private sector. And when I first came here to Hong Kong 6 years ago, I came across these estates, and they were kind of for me quite shocking to an extent that like, wow, 99 towers, all the same. So I was quite I was quite shocked actually to say that. I grew up in a rural area in northern part of Germany, so this was something very new to me. But there was very little information. So we started getting interested into it and started looking at these estates. So this is basically a map of Hong Kong, and currently we're looking at 9 specific estates, and these are the locations of them. There are overall 18 different kind of estates of these private sector in Hong Kong. And they can be categorized in 3 ways. So one is kind of like a grid, the other one is a field, and the third one is a strip. So I'm going to walk you quickly through them. So, and this is really just browsing. So here on the left you have Mai Fo, and I think they should be chronologically. So you have Mai Fo Sun Chun, 1965, built until 1978. Nam Fung Sun Chun, 1978. Both, I think that's wrong. The one is good. Allway Garden in 1981. This is kind of a strip typology. Heng Fa Chen, 1982. I'm going to go a little bit further into detail about them later. Cornhill, City Garden. And you see basically they're all urban formations of an array of towers, and either organized in a strip formation, in a grid formation, or in a field formation. Now 1986, City 1, 1987, Bel Air Garden, 1987, Metro City, 1991, Laguna City, 1991, Whampoa Garden, 1991, South Horizons, 1995, Sunshine City, 1996, Kingswood Villas, 1999, and Ocean Shore, 2000. And I think, and then we have Bel Air Residency, 2008, and Festival City, 2009. So we looked at all these 18, and we kind of looked a little bit more closely to 9 of these estates, and they're kind of representatives of these 3 kind of types. We discovered the grid, the field, and the strip. And they are as well, like, and most of them, they're basically the largest ones. Yeah. So to give you a little bit of a background, so Mai Fo Sun Chun was built 1965 to 1978, and this was built in 8 phases. It has 99 blocks. The towers are from 18 to 21 stories. There are 13,500 units in that estate, and 70,000 to 80,000 people live in this estate. Flat sizes go from 600 square feet to around 1,800 square feet. And so these are kind of like the typical spaces you find. So like they're kind of a view from the urban level, or from the podium upwards. Then we're looking as well at Heng Fa Chen, which is more like a kind of field organization, built 1982, built in 2 phases. This one has 50 blocks, building levels around 18 to 22 stories, and there are about 6,500 units in that estate, and the population is around 19,000. And so again, like just like a quick impression about these spaces. Taikushing, built 1986, 8 phases, 61 blocks, around 20 stories as well, and 12,700 units, and around 70,000 people living there. City garden. I'm sorry, these line drawings, they don't really work on this screen.
Have to wait for the book.
City garden, 1986, 14 blocks, 28 levels, and as well 9,000 people living here. But I guess, like, I mean, what we're trying to kind of probably like bring across a little bit, that there is somehow one model, yeah, and that model is basically replicated throughout Hong Kong, and it follows somehow as well the model of mass production, and it's proliferated around the city, and it basically creates pretty much always the same kind of spaces. Whampoa Garden, 1991. This one has 88 blocks, 10,000 units, and about 40,000 people live there. Laguna City, built 1991, 38 blocks, 8,000 units, and 24,000 people live there. This is South Horizon, built 1995, around 34 blocks, and around 9,800 units, and 31,000 people live there. These are Kingswood Villas, built 1999, 58 blocks. These are getting higher and higher, actually, like, so this is up to 39 stories, 15,000 units, and 21,000 people live there. So Metro City, built 2002, 21 blocks, 6,700 units, 18,000 people. So I'm starting to get repetitive. Repetitious. So the research is going to be, on one hand, a documentation about these estates, yeah, and so we want to make these estates, because there hasn't been much research done about these estates. So we want to kind of like do almost like an inventory, yeah. So we go quite deep into it, and yeah, these are all the plans. So these are kind of, for instance, of Mayfo. As I said before, though it looks very repetitive, it has actually diversity in these plans. Yeah? So there is a range of different kinds of units. The estate has 99 towers, and I think there are actually they're almost like, if you want to talk about types they're all very similar, but like if you want to talk about the actual tower, there are 45 different towers basically, though they look very, very identical. So these are kind of just like some of these towers. So, and we want to get actually even further into it and understand like about these are all the flats. So these are the flats of South Horizon. And to understand almost like, okay, what is basically the majority, because there are kind of a large population of Hong Kong lives in these places, yeah? So how many people live actually in these kind of flat types, yeah? So to understand how many different flat types are there actually, yeah? So it's a kind of really like an inventory, yeah? And as well, like following this inventory is somehow as well an analysis of these estates in terms of whether it's in terms of like the typology of the tower, or as well the flat types. For instance, on the left, that's Whampoa Garden, has 88 towers altogether, but there are 41 different towers. Then you have in the middle, South Horizon has 33 towers altogether and 13 different types. And Laguna City, for instance, has 38 towers and has only 4 types. Yeah, so some of these estates are extremely repetitive. They're almost like all the same flat, whereas others are kind of more diverse. We want to also look this is really difficult to see anyways. We're going to research these estates as well in terms of the density, the inhabitants, number of units, flat area range, tower height range, average inhabitants in each tower, elevator per tower, open space per tower, perimeters, I mean, etc., like a lot of different kinds of aspects we would like to just understand if there's as well some logic between the development over time in these estates. I guess this section we want to kind of close a little bit with a kind of comparison back to kind of the Plan Voisin and Mayfair. Though visually they look very, very similar in terms of, I mean, you have like this kind of crucifix shape as a tower footprint, yeah, which is as well here on the left again seen in the Plan Voisin, and as well very, very small on the right, that's Mayfair. But scale-wise, it's obviously very, very different, yeah. So Corbusier was basically talking in a very, very kind of different way about density, yeah. So Hong Kong took on maybe like the organization of this very, very gridded formation and as well the idea of mass production, yet the density is a very different kind.
I think beyond that, there's a number of other similarities. The positioning of the towers, the idea that most of the public or private estates in Hong Kong are also attached to either a highway system or the MTR system, so that there's an idea of a transportation hub that's also central to housing and to the commercial cores. Many of these large housing estates are not just residential, but like the Corbusier plans, have a commercial or kind of civic hub in the center, or whether that's a shopping mall or an office tower. Taikoo Shing, for example, has a kind of a big commercial and office center at the center of the plan. So, and then the kind of thickness of the ground was another interesting feature that we found between these kind of purist schemes of the 1920s, where recreation and vehicular circulation, pedestrian circulation were spread onto different levels, or the transportation hub made use of different levels for loading or for commercial buses or private cars. And I think the thickening of the ground in these private estates too, with the idea that Christian had mentioned before of a podium, of an underground subway system and recreation happening on top of the podium, also kind of displays this idea of thickness on the ground level that was an instrumental part of the modern visions of the 1920s.
Yeah, so all of these estates are basically, as a typology, if you want to look at it from an architectural point of view, is this kind of typology. It's the so-called the podium tower typology. Yeah? So you have on the bottom you have a podium, which according to the building regulation can be about 50 meters, yeah, and on this 50-meter podium, and that podium contains usually, either it contains amenities or it contains a shopping mall. On top of the podium you have like a little bit of the recreational space, and then a set of towers basically coming on top of that. So this podium tower is basically the state of the art, or this is the typology which is present everywhere in Hong Kong, and has really emerged in the last 2 decades or 3 decades as the predominant building model of efficiency and economy for high density living in Hong Kong. I want to go a bit into a different direction. So right now we have a world population of 7 billion people, which is, and it's kind of expected actually to grow and grow and grow until 2050. I mean, there are kind of until 2050, according to United Nations, it's growing either, if you think of it modestly, to 7.9 billion, or more progressively to 11 billion people. On the other hand, the urban and rural population in the world is as well drastically changing, and I think we are kind of right now at a point where it's 50-50%. So, and the inhabitants living in cities has risen from 3% in the 1800s to 50% in 2008. So when basically for the first time in human history, the world's population was evenly split between the urban and the rural areas. Now, according to the census 2010 in China, 1.33 billion people live in China. And there is this is a quote from a book written by two Dutch, actually a writer and an architect. And I would like to read this actually. In the next 20 years, an estimated 200 million Chinese villagers will become city dwellers, attracted by the profusion of jobs and opportunities in the city. The urbanization rate will increase from about 50% at present to almost 70% to 2030. This means that in the coming century, China will change from a rural into an urban society, a modernization project influencing the lives of hundreds of millions. This transformation involves numbers that thrill the imagination. Consulting firm McKinsey, for instance, notes that in the coming years, China will annually construct more than 1,500 buildings of 30 stories or higher, boiling down to an equivalent of a new Chicago every year. So 280 million village dwellers becoming city dwellers, and I did a kind of quick calculation. So the generic tower has 8 flats per floor and a minimum, let's say, of 3 people per flat and 19-story high. That makes a kind of 450 inhabitants per tower. And so 280 millions divided by 450 is 620,000 towers. Shanghai alone has currently 7,700 towers. So I'm not quite sure if my math is correct, but that kind of like actually kind of is beyond my imagination. Anyways, like these models of the podium tower and as well these estates are basically becoming as well more and more popular. And not only they're not only kind of like the typology in Hong Kong, but they're also becoming popular in other Asian countries and as well in China. So these are kind of some advertisements from China about new kind of homes, these estate houses. And so these are kind of like as well some advertisements of new estates in China. So you see like this idea of Corbusier of mass production and repetitive cheap construction technologies influencing our built environment very, very drastically. So here's another one. I mean, these are kind of, they're like less maybe a little bit about the podium, so they're more like towers, really like in a green field, but they usually have as well, like on the bottom there's somehow like an amenity kind of complex. So the podium tower. Now I want to go a little bit. I want to go a little bit into my own work, and so having lived here for 6 years and as well being confronted with these kind of with the environment of Hong Kong, and as well with these numbers I just mentioned, I developed as well, and Jason did as well, like developed like some maybe different perspectives on how maybe towers should be developed or urbanism should be maybe as well developed. You can't see anything, I'm sorry, but these are kind of basically some diagrams about building codes. So code at the end of the day is basically pretty much govern the way high-rise buildings are constructed, not only in Hong Kong but as well in Asia and in other places. So the building code is very, very much the rule system behind any kind of architectural piece. Again, so this is the podium tower, and for me, I have no problem with that typology. In general, I have no problem with this typology, but I find it as well kind of troublesome the moment it's basically the only typology we have at hand, and it gets repeated over and over again, because I find that these built environments become extremely boring, and you don't have that necessarily so much here on Hong Kong Island. Hong Kong Island is an extremely interesting space, but the moment you just have like just these estates, and they're kind of like really they're going over a certain kind of threshold in terms of numbers, these spaces become repetitive and very, very to me, yeah, boring environments. And so the question is like, what are other kind of maybe possibilities how to think about the development of towers, and as well maybe the development of urban environments and yeah, urban environments. So when I started this project, which I'm going to show, I looked at as well at different kind of environments, and this is a Noli map of Rome, and which is a kind of a figure ground plan, yeah, pretty diverse. So it describes basically the public space and the private space, yeah, and as well, interestingly enough, even churches, like the ground floor of churches, were considered in this plan as public spaces. So this plan kind of like is extremely diverse in terms of its organization. Yeah, I find it also very interesting how other systems around the globe are kind of organized and come into place. And so on the left you have the favela in Brazil, and on the right you have CARLOW in Walled City. Though CARLOW in Walled City is definitely not like an example of a great space, but it's in terms of livability, but it's a very interesting model in terms of how a city can be developed without a plan. Yeah, and when Corbusier basically says the street needs to disappear, the plan should rule. Yeah, so my kind of position is kind of like against that. Yeah, so I think there needs to be somehow a way how we kind of conceive our city, construct our cities, construct our towers, which kind of like deliver somehow different kind of spaces, non-repetitive spaces, more specific spaces. So I think these models, like the favela in Brazil or the CARLOW in Walled Cities, are quite interesting models, and they're kind of to a certain degree self-organized systems. Yeah, so there's no plan for it. There has never been an architect involved in them. Yeah, so they're kind of basically people just take the ground and they start to kind of build. Yeah, and for the CARLOW in Walled City, which was basically run by the Triads for most of its time, there was never a plan as well. And the reason why it needed to kind of disappear was because there was never a foundation for the 7 to, I think, 8 to 9 story building height, like of these, I think, or maybe even more. Yeah, so it was extremely dangerous. Anyways, these kind of self-organizing system kind of very interesting to me. This is an image of so-called 2D cellular automata, which is a mathematical system, and it's as well it's somehow like artificial intelligence, and so I'm very intrigued by these kind of mathematical models, so self-organizing systems in science. And for the project, I translated this into kind of a computer software. So the project tries to kind of like address extruded space and to think about space in a different way, and to say, can we develop like a model that incorporates and a certain amount of open space / white space into kind of a tower typology. So I'm going to go through this quickly. So usually when you start like as an architect, you look usually like really like as a figure ground kind of diagram. Yeah, so you could see this is the crucifix shape, and then they're usually just extruded. Yeah. So what I did is kind of using this device of cellular automata to generate different kinds of towers. So it's a kind of these towers are kind of designed by an artificial intelligence, so to speak, and not necessarily. I'm just, as the architect, I'm just setting up the system, and then the system designs itself, or like the outcome is designed by the system. So these are kind of like just some examples of these towers. They're all kind of like based on the same set of rules, but they all kind of like try to incorporate a set of open space within its configuration. So this red one I'm just going to run through. And so the interesting thing about it is that you're going to have, like, so this is a site, and this is, well, yeah, this is a site boundary. And so this is kind of like the configuration you kind of set on the site. you have a set of like open space on these four corners. And so at a certain point, it turns into a solid volume. And like after a couple of stories again, it turns into a different configuration, and it opens up again like a public zone. Public in a sense, maybe more like an open, like a private open zone. And then it turns again like in a solid, and a cross, solid. Again, these four towers. So it generates new kinds of figure ground configurations, but these figure ground configurations don't exist only on the ground level, but they as well exist in the vertical space. So these are kind of just a set of different kind of figure ground configurations of these towers. And so the idea is that like a typology is no longer anymore like extruded. No, it's kind of like at a certain moment it changes into a different typology, and this different typology offers a different kind of experience of open space, for instance. So in this row you have like the generic, which is just the extrusion. Then this is a kind of a hybrid out of two typologies, and the third one is a hybrid out of four typologies. So and then you have these overlapping spaces in there. And the way we kind of organize this design system is well that immediately in this computational logic, like the computer kind of organized as well the cores and the circulation in it. So these are kind of basically the open spaces you can find in there. And so, for instance, this one on the left, that's a pure massing, and then you have the open spaces within this configuration. And as well, what we felt like is very important for this project is that towers usually, they're obviously private spaces. Yeah? So you have like, you have a core, you have a circulation core in the middle, and that kind of basically access the entire tower. And so the neighborhood is actually very, very limited in these towers. Yeah? So the idea was that in order to kind of activate these open spaces, we felt like we need to break the core, because the core is kind of like basically the street within a tower. So that the moment you have basically, if you want to go all the way up to the tower, you need to kind of almost like find your way in this tower, and you have to kind of like go through different kind of public spaces. In that way, these public spaces would be as well activated, and different kind of programs could be allocated in these zones. So here I'm just gonna give you just some visuals. So I would say the reason for this project was, as I said earlier, to kind of like find a system that allows for variation and not for repetition. Yeah. So and the idea was as well to think of the building code in that sense. Maybe this could be a model for a new kind of building code. Yeah, because the building code is usually defined by a set of parameters, so you can kind of like, as I said earlier, 15 meters, that's what you, up to 15 meters you can build like a podium, and then on top you have like towers, yeah? So in this sense, if you would kind of like develop a new system that would kind of like allow for different kind of like configurations of how we think about public space within the kind of vertical realm. So these were, to think of like basically this computational system as a kind of replacement for the building code. And they're obviously, so they're all kind of they're all kind of like dependent on, no, they're all kind of based on the same system, yet they develop an immense variety of different kinds of and specific outputs. Sorry, these are just like all together. I did like an exhibition as well of that, like in, 2 years ago at the Hong Kong and Shenzhen by City Biennale, and these were kind of just some models of them. So now this project was basically only thinking about the object, only about the tower itself, yeah, and to think of like, okay, how can we incorporate this kind of public / or open space into kind of a tower configuration? How can we make a tower more lively? And so I think it cannot kind of like just only stay at the tower, so it needs to kind of as well be developed within a kind of within a kind of the city idea. Yeah. So after the next couple of images, I have like the next development, which was basically trying to kind of understand how we can start to see this as a possibility to have an array of these kind of towers and to kind of think of it as a kind of a vertical circle, vertical city. So these are just like some impressions. So these are some images of an idea of how to think of these towers like in a configuration of 4 and how to see them as linked towers, and where actually the city is not only anymore about the ground, yeah. So it's not anymore about only the street. The city is happening as well within the building, yeah. So you have everything what is kind of yellow is basically public, accessible space, yeah, which basically every citizen can go to, and so that the life actually extends, or the life kind of continues from the street into the building itself. Yeah. Some plants, and maybe the section is probably better because here you can basically see the idea of like how these towers are connected. And probably, yeah, so it's kind of like a vertical network which basically connects people and brings people together, and as well offers maybe new spaces for new activities within the vertical environment. So new activities can happen. Yeah. And now I'm going to give over to Jason. I don't know if this white is not so helpful sometimes.
Yeah, it's okay. So like Christian, I'll present 2 projects. One is a teaching project that I recently completed with a thesis student at the University of Hong Kong that starts to rethink the organization of towers and estates. And the second is a project that focuses a little bit more on a smaller scale components of towers and buildings. So this is a project supervised by myself and done by a student named Cheng Ching, who was fascinated at the beginning of his thesis year with the idea of transitions between horizontal and vertical forms of circulation. And he did quite a broad study of speed and angle, looking at everything from elevators to escalators to people movers and walkways to all of the other forms of horizontal transportation that we find in Hong Kong, streetcars, MTR, buses and taxis, and started to kind of graph even his travels through the city. So he did a series of studies of his route between his home in Kowloon Bay and Hong Kong U every day, taking care to kind of carefully map where he was in the city and how much time it took him to move between places. So this idea also led him to start to map in terms of space and time some of the commercial hubs of the city, right? So he looked at the I Square Mall, he looked at Times Square and Causeway Bay, or the, what's it called? The Langham Place in Mongkok, where you have these connections, in a sense, between MTR systems and bus systems, underground and above ground, and then large loops of escalators and elevators. And started to kind of map the way that people move through those, and how time, in a sense, organizes our experience of a urban environment. So he went on again to kind of draw exploded axonometric drawings of these various environments and then model them in very specific ways, which allowed him to understand, again, the relationship between architecture and the horizontal and vertical movements through it, or diagonal movements through it, in terms of an escalator. So again, these are models of Times Square and IFC, trying to, again, map how we move through space. So it was really kind of a series of drawings and analyses that start with movement, and kind of backed in, maybe in a way slightly different to Christian's recent work, it's sort of backed into architecture through time and kind of temporal movement. This was a really beautiful series of radial drawings he did and models that he made afterwards, where he would map in time and space not only how long it took on the MTR, but what happens if you combine an MTR trip with an elevator trip with an escalator trip. So what this was leading to is trying to redefine architecture, or at least kind of towers, that allowed him to say, okay, within a given housing estate, we're not going to have any apartments that are outside 15 minutes of the train platform. That instead of using city planning and building codes to regulate where buildings could be in a city or how buildings were actually formed, we're going to think primarily, or in a kind of a hierarchy, starting with time and duration. And beyond the idea of kind of shifting from different modes of transportation to each other, he also started to think about different building forms and how different types of housing could be blended, similar to transportation. It's a little hard to see. This is similar to something that Christian was talking about before, where you might start on the top of a tower with an X or cruciform configuration of housing and lifts, and then change over the course of a tower down to a courtyard configuration. So you end up with these towers that actually blend different types of apartments and different types of external void or internal void in a smooth flow. Again, using the techniques that have really only been around for a couple of decades in terms of 3D modeling with computers, surface modeling techniques that allowed architects to explore forms and configurations that didn't exist years ago. And then came the idea of not repeating, or kind of taking the idea of the linear city of their strip that we were looking at in our estates research, and starting to organize these towers along a linear row, which could be, in a sense, the pathway of the MTR or a linear highway, again with kind of references back to a lot of early 20th century work, including that of Le Corbusier in places like Algiers. But in these kind of tower scenarios, again, the tallest tower is positioned directly above the subway platform in this case, so that by taking into account the time it takes me to move from the platform all the way up to my unit on the top of the tower, I could be there, again, within the window of 15 minutes was the reference in this case. Or if I needed to walk 10 towers away or be kind of moved through a series of people movers and escalators, I could again reach my apartment within the window of 15 minutes. And what this tends to do is something that Hong Kong already does, which is to concentrate housing and commercial activity at the nexus of MTR systems and transportation. Qing was doing this with a kind of a sense of design and a sense of precision that tends to kind of smooth out the actual architecture and housing estate along the kind of smoothness of a commute, right? So making a highly efficient commute to make these kind of cities which then, again, densify at the point of transportation exchange and then tend to change into low-rise housing at the outskirts. Again, sort of parallels to what we saw in the early urban scale work of Le Corbusier. And then he also experimented with taking that linear city built along the top of a rail line and then kind of spiraling it around in a almost relentless sort of density and scale. So if you can imagine this as a kind of a city with the train station in the middle, again, an abstract city in the similar way of Le Corbusier's city for 3 million people. You'd have every one of these apartments within the size of a new town in the new territories being reachable or walkable within 15 minutes. So Christian and I were sort of joking yesterday as we put the lecture together that maybe neither of us would prefer to live in a city like this, or we're not exactly sure of what the urban effects of smoothing out time would be. But as a thesis project that starts to look at the relationships, kind of a smooth relationship between time and space and architecture, it became quite interesting to see how if you rearranged the way that time works or that you move through a place, that the architecture could actually respond in interesting ways. The second and the last project that we'll present today is one also about kind of linearity. It's a project called Linear Domesticity, or the Hong Kong Single Occupancy Strip, or HKSOS. This was a project that I did in my office for the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale just this past year, which curator Colin Fournier was calling for ideas that represented the ideal city. And this is actually a project which kind of responds as a critique to the non-ideal city. In a sense, one where those of us who live in Hong Kong know that given the value of land, the population size, the average price per square foot for a property measuring between 1,000 and 1,500 square feet in Kowloon went up 3.76 times over the past 10 years. So the project is kind of responding to the higher price of real estate in Hong Kong and the shrinking size of the places that we actually live in. Of course, everyone involved with real estate, rental or buying has probably known that we're at a kind of all-time high, even beating the levels we saw in 1997 in terms of Hong Kong real estate. And so this project started to look at, what's the smallest unit of space, or the smallest space that people in Hong Kong could start to live in. There are these photographs done by the Society for Community Organization of these cubicle apartments. I think many of us probably know about the cage homes, the subdivided flats of Hong Kong that kind of put people into smaller and smaller spaces. I've also been very interested in the last 8 years since living in the city in these kind of projected windows, these bay windows that again are very cellular and relentless over the city, especially in certain neighborhoods that were built during the 80s and 90s. And the bay window is again a kind of result of the Hong Kong Building Code, in which it was a kind of a grant or a bonus space to developers who could build this or give residents this additional space in the building without being charged, in a sense, for additional GFA, or gross floor area. So it's kind of a bonus for the developers, and that in some ways they sort of hand over to residents. And they were, up until recently, strictly regulated so that they could only be 50 centimeters deep, 50 centimeters off the floor, and 50 centimeters from the ceiling. They could only take up 50% of the perimeter wall in any room. So there's a whole set of building regulations about these, and also building incentives that were given by the government to developers to spur on different industries in the region. So many of these bay windows are produced in precast manufacturing plants in Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta region of China. And actually they're looked at as a kind of a green, sustainable building type because they reduce the overall construction length and duration, and they reduce site work. So developers are actually given financial incentives to use precast concrete construction in this case. So kind of building off of that, I started to look with my students at what if you didn't take the dimensional regulations of a bay window at 50 centimeters deep and off the floor, but what if we thought about it in different terms? If we thought about it volumetrically, or if we got away from the strict dimensional regulations of these, then we could take a different window. If we measure the volume, then we could squeeze it but have it extend further out, or we could make it thinner and cover a larger expansive wall. So this also involved looking at the ways in which Hong Kong residents and other people in Macau and China start to use the windows in a building for storage, for bookcases, for working stations, and for laundry. And to try to take these informal uses of architecture and then think about what it's like to live on the periphery of an apartment or a building. So this is an experiment a couple of years ago. We're using the same sort of parametric software that Christian had presented before, modeling software which could subtly change the size, the depth, and the orientation of window bays, and then use digital fabrication technology to then create a kind of a catalog of bay windows in Hong Kong that could be useful for different types of activities or domestic activities. Again, a kind of a catalog of windows. And then this is a diagram of taking actually a floor plan of one of the housing estate towers in South Horizons on Ap Lei Chau, and in a sense sort of unfolding it. So understanding that as humans in towers, we tend to live at the periphery of the apartment. We tend to kind of move furniture to the outer wall. Bay windows and laundry and air conditioners extend to the outside, and then furnishings extend to the inside. So this was a kind of a graphic exercise of unwrapping a tower. Here we see kind of a tower footprint on the bottom, which then gets kind of conceptually cut and then extended like a string to unfurl, in a sense, the floor plan into a straight line. And then if we thought about that apartment or as only 1.5 meters thick, maybe we could use the bay window that not only extends to the outside, but then extends to the inside in a way to represent the rooms that we usually associate with domestic activities. So in this kind of one linear apartment, we move from the kind of a very small lift and stair core on the right to a series of rooms which would include a kind of a toilet and shower, to a working area, to a kitchen, to a dining room, and eventually out to a balcony. Imagining that within each of these spaces, you're sort of on the edge of the city, positioning between the interior space and the exterior space of the city on the outside. And then if we start to stack these, different residents or different designers could rearrange the activities within them, offering not a whole strip of toilets necessarily or living rooms, but you could start to mix the arrangement or the sequencing of rooms along, both horizontally and vertically, and then kind of stack them and apply this kind of vertical pancake of a building to the sides of, to the blank walls of industrial factories in Taiwan or other spaces in the city that might be undervalued. So again, by kind of looking at how tight the domestic space could actually be in Hong Kong, starting to aggregate that over a series of units, could we, I guess, add value back to the city in places where there's not that much value at the moment. So I think each of these projects kind of touches on the ideas of production and standardization, whether we're trying to rethink production in terms of the possibilities of today, in terms of computation or fabrication, or to try to break away from ideas of standardization by using processes that make customization much more tangible in this era of architecture and building. And hopefully, maybe we raised a couple of issues or questions, and we're welcome to try to answer them as best as we can in the next few minutes. But thanks very much.
they're amazing. I never knew we squeeze so much of Hong Kong standardized repetitive architecture. So this is clearly, a thinking architect's presentation. Thank you. And earlier, those of you who missed my introduction, the two of them have a lot in common. And also, one more thing that's in common is that among our students, especially our women students, they are considered most stylish and best looking professors in our department. So that means the rest of us, including me, look at them and say, we hate you.
Come on, Hoyin.
Anyway, questions? I know there are a lot of architects around here.
But I'm not an architect, but I was just wondering whether both of you have lived or are living in this kind of mass production housing estate before. Well, because, for example, like me, well, I live in this kind of homes since I was born. So I don't know how you feel about that, if you do really have experience living in this kind of housing. And my second question is, it seems that, so you talk about circulation and, and other factors, but I'm not sure whether whether the use of plot ratio has been taken into consideration when you talk about different plans of those buildings. And also, my third question is, at the very beginning, well, I'm not sure whether Le Corbusier has considered whether his client will get this kind of boring effect as an outcome.
I'll hear you guys answering the questions.
Well, I can start with the first one. I'm living here on Hong Kong Island in a tower as well, and high up. I have a beautiful view, actually. And that's not in an estate. Yeah? I have never lived in an estate. And I think actually they work in Hong Kong actually quite well. We have visited them obviously, yeah, and so we looked at them quite carefully. And as well, I know from others that they, yeah, as I said, work quite well here, and people appreciate actually these estates. Now, coming from Europe, in Europe you have these models are not necessarily, you don't see them only in Hong Kong. You have seen them as well in Paris, or you see them in Berlin, or in Hamburg, or in any kind of city in Europe as well. You see them in America. And because there's more space, yeah, here they work because out of necessity, yeah. So there is just nothing else, yeah. So they work, yeah, pretty well. In Europe, they became actually problematic after a certain time, yeah. So in Paris, for instance, the banlieue, they have as well these estates, and they became basically like social. Problematic spaces, yeah, for the society. So I don't think that you can say per se they're not good spaces or so. I don't think you can say that. But I think they are very repetitive, and I think that's something. If you look into cities which had a chance to grow over centuries. These spaces are much more attractive and more interesting, yeah. And if you look into cities, how fast cities are developed these days, in today's world, over 1, 10 decades, no, 1 or 2 or 3 decades. If you think about Shenzhen, which has been developed only in 3 decades, from a little village to 12 million or so, it's a different kind of speed, yeah. So the question is like, what kind of impact these models, yeah, have basically on our on the dwellers, yeah, and on the society. If you say you grew up in those, I can as well. I mean, I think that's probably, the human race is pretty adaptable, yeah. So to any kind of like situation, yeah. And so maybe as well in that sense, like me coming from Europe, I mean, I'm like, whoa, yeah, it's very interesting to see it here, and so. For me, on first sight, it's always like I'm questioning it, Yeah. So versus when you grew up in something, you're not questioning it anymore. Yeah? So and I think I want to be kind of value free somehow. I don't want to kind of say it's bad or so. Yeah. I think it definitely has its definitely has certain qualities, I guess, as well. But I think the main issue is that basically for me is that there's extreme repetition in terms of spaces, in terms of facades, in terms of flats, and that kind of like I'm highly critical of.
But yeah, I think that criticality goes beyond just the appearance of things, and I think in Corb's development of these ideas, it was maybe less about aesthetics and more about performance and function and efficiency. And I think that is still something that architects and developers and all of us sort of value in a sense to have places that work. But the repetition also creates performance problems, right? The ability to kind of change the size or the flexibility of a flat, right? To have one tower where all of the apartment sizes are built for families that need 3 bedrooms, rather than having a kind of a range of flat sizes for different family sizes or users that could promote a little bit more diversity within a building type that not only starts to challenge the way that standardized buildings look, but the way they perform in terms of communities with a variety of people living within there, right? Where you can mix maybe young and elderly people together or singles and couples together with families to try to create or ensure that you don't have a society that is purely segregated by the architecture we make and the planning and the rules that we create.
The developers, they are introducing more special units now for new projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think smart developers are a little bit more think in the longer term rather than the shorter term. But certainly all over the world, you still have people thinking primarily about costs and then about value and quality secondarily. So I think that part of the argument here is, again, not only just about aesthetics and form, but how do you think about ways to use computation and advanced modeling and mass customization to improve the way that buildings work and the way that lives within them also work. There's always going to be bad developers and good developers, bad architects and good architects. I think it's on a case-by-case basis. It's interesting to look at different estates in Hong Kong that were made by the same developer and look at the tools that were developed for one estate and then kind of moved over, or how developers actually developed their own designs over time, not only in reaction to the market and building codes, but in reaction to the qualities of space that they discovered along the way.
I might add, we grew up in Singapore. I grew up in Singapore. Public housing is a big thing in Singapore, considering that 80% of the Singaporean population live in public housing, essentially subsidized housing. And in the 70s, and when shortly after Singapore became a nation, and public housing started to take off in a very huge way. And standardization, what today considered as repetitive, boring, standardization was seen as a good thing. So you can see, depending on the circumstances, the time, communities, and social needs, and all that, and the same thing can be seen as good or bad. Values are never constant, it's always changing.
I mean, architecture in that sense is extremely, has a lot to do with ideology, yeah, and so Le Corbusier was obviously, he was kind of presenting his ideology to the audience of his time, yeah, and to kind of convince people about his way of thinking.
It's just a comment, I guess as a long time as a resident. It's interesting to see that the public housing that made through the earlier buildings that walk through places like this, there's always more outdoor space. This is what I noticed. There's more balconies, there's bigger balconies, there's more outdoor space down around the lower floors and more walkways. And then I look at the public housing in between, and it gets less and less outdoor space. No balconies, not a lot of like common areas for shops and things out where you can be outside. And then I look at the newer ones, you're beginning to see balconies come back, you get a little bit bigger, more outdoor space, more common public areas. And then I look at your designs, the sort of artificial intelligence designs, and the first thing you talk about is more public space, and it looks like to me, I can't tell if there's glass there or not, but more outdoor space. It's a return to what they were doing 60, 70, 80 years ago, and to me, more human. I mean, I think the problem is, for me, just personally, looking at some of those in-between 70s and 80s and 90s developments, they look like ant farms. I mean, there's no outside, everything's enclosed in glass, even the public spaces, and it's very sort of suffocating.
But so much of that goes back to the building code. And if you think about balconies, for example, up until recently, balconies weren't allowed in the building code, or they were allowed, but they were not exempt from GFA, right, from the amount of space that a developer could build. So recently, when a certain size of balcony was granted GFA exemption, then they start to appear because they're like a bonus space for the developer. He doesn't have to count that towards his limit of space, right, his saleable space. Clubhouses were like this in private developments, right? They were unlimited. You could have a clubhouse which had all the amenities you wanted, and developers were building, like Island Crest in Sayingpun has a big clubhouse and pool, which provides more amenities for the residents without a kind of a cost to the developer. But then they've restricted clubhouses again. So now you'll see private development start to constrain the size. In the next 10 years, you'll probably see fewer and fewer swimming pools. Your gym will go from 20 machines to 4 machines because it's all regulated by these kind of GFA and financial tools that expand that. So I think if it's important for architects and citizens, I think, to understand them and maybe to try to push back against them or to give developers incentives to push back against them or to open them up. Because then that contributes to other types of performance and value that are not financial.
The first one is just in response to what you just mentioned about the clubhouse space. The reason why the government restricted back is because all these extra clubhouses, all these public amenities, although they are given the GFA and accountable, which is actually the government gave them to the developers for free, but the developers actually sell the space because in Hong Kong they sell all properties by the building area, so which includes all this extra space. So there was an outcry from the public saying that I buy 1,000 square foot apartment, how come there's only 600 square feet?
Yeah.
So that was unreal. But the other thing is, in your studies about all this housing, and I'm sure you looked at the plot ratio from like I think starting from Mei Century to the more recent years. And I think in the 70s, you can get the residential plot ratio of 8. And now, I think because of not because of building regulation, but because of town plan and outline zoning plan, a lot of more the residential is restricted plot ratio 5. And in your study, have you compared that to other cities in the world for residential plot ratio, and what do you think is there an optimum plot ratio, or is it in Hong Kong the plot ratio of 8 for the older district is just way too high, or have you do stuff like that?
Well, the plot ratio, I mean, it's not even throughout Hong Kong.
No.
Yeah, I mean, you have like, I mean, I know that you, for instance, on the island, on the shore, you have like, I think, almost like a plot ratio of 9.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the further you go up the hill, then up the hill you have like a plot ratio of 5. Yeah. Typical house. Yeah.
This type of estate.
I think personally, like in my work, the plot ratio is, I think, less of a problem for me. I think there is the need for density is a given, I guess. Yeah, especially if you think about the opposite model. Yeah, like the American model. Yeah, which is basically like a plot ratio of 1, so to speak, in the suburbs of any given city.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably 0.1 in many
Well,
places.
that's as well not a sustainable model. Yeah, so I think the call for density is a must. Yeah, and I think especially like in places like Asia, yeah, with extreme large populations. Yeah, I agree that plot ratios of I think my 4 has, if I remember correctly, is something like 7 or something, 6 or 7. I think that's what my 4 is. But funny enough, it's very dense, yeah. But if you're there, it works, yeah. And it works because of the climate, yeah. Because the climate is very different, yeah. And it kind of like creates these kind of small environments which kind of provide then somehow through this density a lot of shading, yeah. That then these open spaces are somehow as well livable, yeah. I mean, if Stacy say, okay, you kind of basically you're looking for you feel like there's not enough open space. Yeah, no, but yeah, no, but no, there's not enough open space. But open space, I think, is as well, and in places like Asia is a different thing than in places like America or in Europe, yeah, because of the climate, yeah. So I think like sometimes actually this density makes actually an open space even just livable. And like in Hong Kong, as an example, I mean, you have these back alleys, yeah, which are throughout the city, throughout the island. They are as well used by the residents, yeah. Whether they're kind of small kind of like restaurants or so, as well allocated in these alleyways or so. But they're quite attractive as well, yeah, these spaces. And so, though they're quite coming back to the density, they're maybe kind of dark, yeah, but they're kind of as well, especially at temperatures at night, they become as well spaces which are quite livable, you know, for open spaces. So for me, I think the density is not hasn't been really like too much an issue for me, actually. Yeah.
Question a bit more, just kind of going back, not finite point of view, sort of idealistic or conceptually. It's interesting to see that here we're comparing projects that were not built to projects that were built sort of out of an idea versus a necessity. Mm-hmm. Obviously the ones in Hong Kong. And Corbu goes to New York somewhere in the 50s or 60s and says...
30s.
30s? Sorry. Bad history there. But he said, I think his comment was they're too close together and too big, so it really was criticizing New York. So I'm wondering, which I think anybody who's visited there thinks it works really well. I'm wondering what would be your perspective that you've been researching so much on Corbu. What would be in his perspective if he would visit Hong Kong today?
Yeah, no, I think I think it's a great comment. He went to New York for the first time, I think, in 1935, and said exactly that. He loved the idea of skyscrapers and really praised North America at the time, New York and Chicago, for building so many skyscrapers as this. He loved the idea of density, and his own cities tried to kind of bring everything together into this hub of transportation in the middle, in the name of efficiency, that you could walk to work and be from your low-rise housing to your office tower in 15 minutes or so, and then get to the train station and then take a train to another city. So density and efficiency, I think he was very much in favor of, and in that respect, I think Hong Kong is one of the kind of most in Rem's words about kind of smooth congestion, right? I think Hong Kong has to be the most smoothly congested city that I've ever lived in, right? That you have this extreme density pushed up to the edges of the harbor, but because of the redundant forms of transportation and mass transportation that we have, somehow it works out most of the time. But you're exactly right. In the case of New York, he looked at the city and said, no, you're going about it all wrong. You should push all of the skyscrapers in Manhattan to 1 or 2 towers, so then you have open views of the environment, of the sky, and everything is kind of washed in light and air. So it would be very curious to see how he would see Hong Kong, whether he would view it in the same way as New York in 1935, or whether he would have a different take on the 7 billion of us kind of walking around the surface of the earth and then think differently.
Is there time? So, any more questions?
Sorry. Question again. Under the current environment, current situation in Hong Kong, now that the government says, well, we are in huge demand of housing, and then the government has been pushing fast to building homes, and then it also introduces stipulation on number of units built and also size of the units. So, do all these factors affect the creativity of architects?
I'm not building in Hong Kong, but it affects the creativity definitely of architects. And I mean, actually, interesting enough, I mean, yes, Hong Kong is in need for housing, for space, yeah, for housing projects. So is Singapore, yeah. Singapore as well. They recently, I think they started a new kind of new building boom as well on public housing. Yeah. Yet in Singapore, you see quite interesting models, new models occurring, yeah, which are basically thinking as well about similar ideas which I showed, like about more vertical spaces for residents, open spaces, yeah, outdoor spaces, yeah, for different activities. There's this one.
Linking towers.
Yeah, linking different towers, yeah, linking different kind of communities together. There's this one example called Duxton Pinnacle, the Pinnacle at Duxton, which is probably one of the largest estates in Singapore, I guess, currently, which is 50 stories high, or what was it? Yeah, around 50 stories high, and so there have 6, 7, 8 towers, and they're linked together, and they're on 2 very strategic moments, like one in the middle and one on the top. And so you basically you have a running track on the middle at 25 story, at the level of 25th story. And so there are new models kind of like starting to occur in these environments which are for need for housing. Yet in Hong Kong you don't see that, because in Hong Kong it's on one hand, it's extremely regulated, yeah, and on the second hand, I think like as well, maybe we as architects we don't push enough, yeah, and we should have more voice as well within the regulating sector, yeah, or we should go as architects as well into the regulating sector.
Sure, it's exaggerating a lot of time the creativity of the architects in applying design in housing, especially, is very much a matter of government policy. In the case of Singapore, it is the government policy that drive for world-class architectural design. So it's a policy for architectural design. And so as a result, we get Dutch heights. So it's very innovative form of public housing, where you have variation on the floors, very much like what you're experimenting with, but yours is even more extreme. So the mission of the Singapore government, through their policy, is encouraging architects. I mean, these are not designed by government architects, it's outsourced to private architects. And through this policy, the Singapore government is encouraging private architects to be more creative and to break free from this repetition, standardization of public housing design. So
Well, I think, I mean, in cities like Hong Kong and Singapore, there are very close relationships on large projects like this between developers and government, and then between architects and developers. And I think in some ways those relationships are helpful because it allows, housing for 40,000 people to be built in one estate. But then if the architect is not challenging the developer and the developer is not challenging the government necessarily, then you have these sort of syndicates of players that are all working towards the same goal, and innovation gets pushed out. I think if you look at other models, there's a lot of housing competitions in Europe, for instance, that open up social housing to anyone, any young or old architect who's willing to enter the competition. And that competition between architects maybe reduces the salary level in some places, but it also allows for innovation because there's always new thinking, and the value is based on not cost so much as different types of quality. So.
Holland's got some extremely waiting for public housing design.
Yeah, yeah. But the same thing is that there's a lot of it's competition based, and rather than in many cases here a kind of hand in hand, highly efficient way of getting housing built, but creativity is questionable in many cases.
So I mean, at least it's a good thing that the Hong Kong people are starting to question the validity of such a repetitive housing drive for efficiency at the expense of everything else. So I mean, they can see mutual attrition and decent and the students they're starting to critique and challenge the established way of design. So at least we are starting this. Hopefully, it will turn into a revolution.
Yeah.
It's great.
There's more and more almost on the rock pressure to build more housing. And it's going to be pretty hard to find plots that big enough to accommodate, 10 to 20 towers, especially in urban areas. We're talking something about reclaiming farmland in the new territories. And with that, people are displaced, where supplies are going to be lost, and it's needed. How important do you think it is to strike a balance between urban and rural areas in a place like Hong Kong?
Well, I think there's a lot of controversy and questions there. I think Hong Kong we often look at as the special administrator. So you look at Hong Kong in the context of the Pearl River Delta rather than just the kind of island, a handful of islands and the new territories. And I think if you look at it a little bit more regionally, then you see that actually the kind of food that we eat and the resources that we have don't just come from the SAR, but come from the entire region. So in that sense, maybe it might be provocative or controversial, but maybe it makes sense to develop things where we need housing if we're getting 80 or 90% of our food from the broader region. So it becomes very political in that sense about how do we think about the city and the borders that we live in terms of what is really the region. I mean, probably most of the vegetables that I eat or more of the vegetables that I eat are coming from Australia rather than the new territories. So, maybe and there's value probably to both for many people. So where do you position the kind of political, economic value of things like farmland with other things like housing? And certainly there's a debate on both sides.
Yeah, just to get back, Christian was mentioning already that the kind of concurrent kind of shading of the skyscraper, or the density arrangement within the city is a really kind of positive aspect, but that at the moment is more like coincidental, right?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, when one looks at like how Le Corbusier, obviously what he had in mind was like everybody's getting sun into his window equally, and obviously here the opposite is almost the case. It would be really good if the towers would really shade each other so that there's as little sunlight and therefore like heat being permeated into the flats. So in some ways, some of those arrangements that you were showing, like the field or the grid, like they would actually be quite sort of, well, probably they have taken that a little bit into account, I suppose. And nowadays that could be actually done much more specifically, I suppose. but others, for instance, the linear one, is completely ignoring this kind of fact. So I wonder if these things, were, from your knowledge, have been taken into account. This kind of looking at towers more like fields and not so much as individual objects in terms of the system, the performance, the self-shading, etc.
I mean, from what we discovered so far is, I mean, like the linear types, yeah, the more strict type kind of organizations of these estates, they're actually, starting to occur much more in the last 20 years or so, yeah. So, I mean, Bel Air is an example as well, yeah, like and I think, you know, in that sense, you know, they're always driven by a set of factors, which is kind of natural ventilation and then views. Super important, yeah. So, and I guess like the moment you want to deal with views, you go for the strip kind of configuration, yeah. And the public, I think like especially like because these are kind of privately owned estates, and in privately owned estates, the public or the open space is in general not really necessarily considered as valuable, yeah. So you see, like in public housing estates, you see much more like the architects who kind of like design these spaces, that they're kind of considering that as a more important factor than in private estates. Yeah. So I think the clubhouse is, or like the public zone is probably internalized into the podium. Yeah. So and and views become like really like the prime, the dominant factor almost like in these estates. Yeah.
But now I think recently Hong Kong is starting to look at things like urban ventilation much more actively. So buildings and developments need to be tested, or simulations need to be run for wind, not only for kind of stability in typhoons, but also to ensure that neighborhoods are being ventilated in warm and cold seasons.
But in that way, the podium tower is really a problem, no? Because down there where everybody walks and where all the traffic is, and you get really pollution completely accumulated. Instead, maybe that really needs to be kind of rethought in some ways. Like also with much more pollution coming in from mainland China, at some point it's really going to get as bad as Beijing. I hope not.
Yeah, then you'll have to go to Singapore. Holger just moved, or is about to move from Beijing. You're staying ahead of the cloud.
We still have time. Shall we have one more question? No, from the wives. Oh, by the way, the wives
He's like so funny, yeah?
Oh, it's good that the wife to support your man.
If I have to make a comment, I'll make a comment.
Yes, please. You know, okay. You have the last word. The wife always has the last word.
I wanted to reply to Stacey's comment that I think we're just very used to having outdoor space and defining that as quality of life. But I think it really depends on the surroundings and the weather and humidity. I think a lot of people in Hong Kong actually prefer being indoors. And I think it's just a definition of how you define quality of life, luxury, or being able to afford a lot of aircon is considered, I don't know, I've only lived here for a couple of years, but the way I understand it is considered as a luxury. And then pollution, I'm sure we talk about China, actually being indoors might be more sought after than being outdoors. I don't know if that has any influence on the development of the city. We should ask the experts.
Jason, answer your wife.
One shot will talk about.
I know. Well, I mean, I think Hong Kong is, I love Hong Kong because it's so easy to move from areas of density to the top of the peak or the middle of the harbor or onto a beach or something. So I think in all cities it's amazing, or it's wonderful to be outdoors, and in certain conditions that's exactly where you want to be. Of course, if air conditioning takes electricity and power in a world where electricity and fossil fuels are becoming more and more expensive, then maybe the city, which is comprised largely of housing, then needs to think about different ways to stay cool. I think the role of standardization in that come back not only to outdoor space or natural ventilation, but then exactly what Holger was talking about, which is how buildings might respond to solar exposure and shading. Right now, all of these towers in both of the schemes, the Paris and the Hong Kong scheme, you could position the tower any direction. It's basically the same whether it's facing north or west or south. So buildings that need to kind of perform a little bit better, not only in terms of maybe porosity or indoor and outdoor space for the kind of values of our lives, but also the way that buildings handle wind and sun, I think is now much more possible to think of with the tools we have, rather than the kind of tools of 1965, which drew one tower and sort of repeat it and don't care about the orientation necessarily. So I think in the long term, we need to take advantage of all of these tools and strategies to think about performance on all sorts of levels, right? Aesthetic, cultural, social, and energy and ecology as well. So I think it depends on how you define performance and you define your values in that.
That must be someone who was born in Hong Kong and has been living there his entire life. Do you feel that urge to be more outward? Is it something missing, or is it really a Western concept? I just always find we come with, like Christian said, we grew up in a very different environment and we come with your own values. But obviously they can be very different from someone.
Very true.
Well, Christian's right, you are homeowner.
We have to switch seats.
He's so easygoing.
Oh my God.
I mean, when I'm with my family, who all are Chinese and stuff, they like to stay indoors, and I'm happy indoors as well. But yeah, just really different than who you
Do you want an apartment with a balcony or without a? Your apartment has big balconies.
we never use that balcony.
We use terraces, right?
Let's.
One last one for local.
Yeah.
I grew up in Whampoa. I lived there all my life.
Whampoa?
Whampoa,
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, I mean, like all the kids, the neighborhood, we could just go to the park and hang out. But now the kids have the internet, so they're all staying indoors.
Yeah.
It's true. Like I live in Whampoa Estate.
Yeah.
Okay,
So that's next door.
Next door, right?
Yeah.
Next door. And then we used to have a park. And then I think I was 10 or something, the park was gone because we really need more housing, we need more buildings. So, and then after that, we started going to a local gallery because they have the park. So we started going there to have to play and walk around and things like that. And also it's near to the waterfront. Then I think now, I usually only see really young kids, like toddlers, who play in the park with their mates. But kids like staying indoors.
But I think that's a very interesting point, because the same thing is happening in places where there's much more outdoor space. Like kids like to spend time in front of TV and their computer, even though they have to.
They have the space, they're not using. Yeah. And I think if you ask the local, if they want more indoor space or outdoor space, I think there will be more indoor space. Yeah.
This is as well like if you look at the kind of development, especially of these housing typologies, over time, and you compare so basically the private estates, they never really like cared too much for public space. Yeah, I mean they have basically public space on the podium, on top of the podium. And some of the estates, most of the estates are as well accessible for the public as well. Yeah, so they're really publicly accessible. They're not private. Yeah, but they're not necessarily. I don't think that they're really like that. There's a real care for them in terms of the development, in terms of the design. And as I mentioned earlier, you can really see that architects in the beginning of the 1960s, 70s, they really kind of start to kind of think of how to connect community through that space as well. Yeah, it's not only like it's not only happening on the ground level. It happens as well, like to a certain extent as well in the vertical realm. Yeah. Yet, if you look at the latest developments, public housing, they basically as well. It's kind of like the public domain within these estates is starting to get more and more diminished, and it's more and more about the private space. Yeah. Now you can argue whether that's good or not. I would like to have as well more private space conceptually, but on the other hand, I wouldn't mind as well to have as well public space within an estate or within any kind of like building configuration. Yeah. I think there are like probably a lot of different positions on this. Yeah. In Europe, coming from Europe, in Europe it has been always like a big debate on how to kind of think of public space within kind of building configurations. Yeah. So it's a very European as well way of thinking of how to think about public space. They're very important. Yeah. The thing with public space as well is that the way it's as well seen in Germany, public space at least, I mean, that's kind of where you can as well voice out your opinion, yeah? So in a shopping mall, you're not allowed to do that, you know? Like, so that's controlled, that's privately controlled, you know?
Depends on what your message is. You can say that you love Prada.
Okay.
Okay.
There's no more question. Then, well, it's been a really wonderful lecture, and as well as a very good discussion. I think this is like an hour-long, almost an hour-long discussion. And very good question, and even better answers. So with that, round of applause for Jason and Christian.